So thank you very much, Professor.
Thank you very much, Gergely. I will try to project my voice over the our neighbouring musical accompaniment. Maybe they can build up to a crescendo as I lead to my denouement, which I'm not really going to do. No, thank you very much. Thanks very much to also the Kensei Foundation for having me here, and to my friend and colleague, Professor Szántó, who's been showing me a good time around Budapest, my first visit here. So as Gergely said, yeah, I'm going to talk mainly about the Amṛtasiddhi. So this is actually, well, first of all, what have I got? All working there, good, the text working. You probably can't read that, but that's a list of relevant publications. You'll find them on my academia.edu page. They're in a sort of, well, the order is not particularly thought out, but the first one, in fact, is sort of contextualizing the genesis of this text and then its reception. I'm going to talk a bit about that later on. And then the other two, well, the next one is an article about the text itself, and then there's one contextualizing the whole history of the early development of physical yoga. And then finally is this one, which I also have a slide of, this book. So this book is the reason I'm here, really. I had I ran a 5-year project on the history of physical yoga, at the heart of which was editing and translating 10 key texts, which were all in Sanskrit. The oldest of them was this text called the Amṛtasiddhi. And in the process of editing, I worked on it for quite a long time. I was involved with various reading groups where we read my working edition, tried to make sense of the text as we went along. So first of all, I think oh, sorry, I've gone in a wrong order. I should have looked at my slides beforehand. I put these together a while ago. But why is this text so important? Okay, why did I make it the first text to edit in the project? So it introduces various key practices and principles that are first, of Haṭhayoga, of physical yoga, which we don't find anywhere else in any text. So the first of these, and I'll come back to this, and we were talking about this just before I was here, is the necessity of the body for success in yoga. And the text, in fact, presents quite an extreme position in that it says that meditation, practices involving the mind, are completely, won't work. There's no way you can control the mind with the mind. The only way you can control the mind is using certain elements in the body, in particular the breath, and it then teaches these practices for controlling the breath. Its first 10 chapters, there are 35 chapters. Their breakup is slightly odd. In fact, it seems like one long chapter was broken up into lots of small chapters. But the first 10 chapters tell you about the different elements in the body that need to be manipulated in order to achieve success in yoga. And so it introduces in Sanskrit for the first time, or in India for the first time, this triad in the body of the sun and the moon and fire. So sun and fire are kind of conflated. They're situated at the bottom of the central channel in the body, and then at the top of the central channel is the moon. And there's this idea that the moon is pouring forth nectar, bindu, which is kind of equated with semen, and that's constantly dripping down and being burnt up by the fire at the bottom of the central channel. Another sort of key aspect is this notion of 3 grunthis, or knots. Okay, so these are kind of blockages in the central channel, because what you want to do with your practice is move the breath, and thereby bindu as well, up through this central channel, through these 3 knots along the way. It also introduces for the first time a connection. It says there's a connection between the mind and the breath and bindu, so this principle of nectar or semen. We know from a long time before there's been a connection between the mind and breath, so the idea that if you can control the breath, you also control the mind. We find that in the Chandogya Upanishad, so that goes a long way back. But to add bindu into this mix is a new thing. And all these ideas then get picked up in the many subsequent texts composed about physical yoga. It also introduces an idea of 4 stages. Here we have this arambha, gharta, parichaya, and nishpatti, which it picked up in quite a few subsequent texts, but not all of them. The idea of there being 4 different levels of practitioner. okay, 4 grades of practitioner. So I think it says, if I remember rightly, you know, the lowest grade of practitioner will only reach 1 stage after 12 years, whereas the best practitioner will get through the lot in 3 years, I think it is. And then, okay, so the key part of the, you know, key teaching perhaps that most people will be most interested in are the 3 practices. So how do you manipulate the breath in order to control the mind and to raise the breath up the central channel and also keep bindu up in the head? And they are, as you can see there, Mahamudra, Mahabandha, and Mahaveda. So the first one, Mahamudra. And those of you, I mean, I think there's probably many people here who probably know a bit more about Tantric Buddhism than I do, but Mahamudra is obviously a key term in many different schools of Vajrayana Buddhism. Here, I think it's being used almost ironically. Well, but the text is taking this idea that you find in lots of other Tantric Buddhist texts, and they're saying actually Mahamudra is just sitting like that, sitting with your left heel, your left foot at the heel, sticking out your right foot, holding your big toe. Okay, so that's the first of the 3 practices. We do find this interesting point here is the subsequent reception or use of these practices in later yoga traditions. So here we see Krishnamacharya, who is the sort of rightly credited with being the father of modern yoga. He's the guru of Iyengar, Iyengar, Pattabhi Jois, and various others who are extremely influential in global physical yoga practice. So here he is doing Mahamudra. Now the next practice, Mahabandha. So Mahamudra literally means the great seal, so it does have a kind of, you can kind of understand it as being applied to the body. It's also a term in alchemy, and I'll come back to that, as is Mahabandha. Now Mahabandha means the great lock, and in this text it's performed by, obviously these illustrations are from much later, but the idea in the Amṛtasiddhi is that the Mahabandha, the great lock, after you've inhaled in Mahamudra, you then contract the perineal region with, it's both called Yoni Bandha and Mula Bandha. So I think this is probably the first, almost certainly the first time that this phrase or this name Mula Bandha occurs, which we then find obviously very commonly in subsequent Haṭhayoga texts. So you seal the bottom of the central channel with this perineal lock, and then the other part of the practice is the Kantha Bandha, so the throat lock like that. So the idea is you've inhaled and then you lock the breath within the central channel with these 2 locks. Then the next practice, well, this again is found in sort of less frequently. Normally in subsequent later yoga teachings we don't get this idea of the Mahabandha being 2 practices together. It's normally split into its 2 components, and usually another one is added, the Uddiyana Bandha, which is this sort of lock of the chest where you pull the diaphragm in. But here, yeah, we do find it in quite a lot of modern treatises on yoga practice. So here from Satyananda Saraswati's rather classic book, Asana, Pranayama, Mudra and Bandha. And then the third practice is the most sort of, was definitely the hardest to make sense of within the text, called Mahaveda, which again, Veda is an important term in alchemy, and as I mentioned, I come back to this sort of alchemical framing of the practice. I think it's very important for understanding what's going on. It means, its sort of literal meaning is piercing, but it also comes to mean sort of transmutation in alchemy, so it's an idea of, you know, you're transforming your person in yoga practice. Now, in my next slide is here. I'm going to have to snap it. So it's quite good. I'll just pause that there because I'm going to have to change program because the film's not going to work here. But in the Amṛtasiddhi, what we decided, the way this Mahaveda is done is you adopt a sort of squatting posture on the. Obviously, I could do it, but I won't do it because this is in the way and you wouldn't be able to see. But you adopt a squatting posture, and then you lift your buttocks up and drop them back down onto your heels, so that the breath that's been compressed in your abdomen, then the idea is that then shoots up into the central channel, and you have to do it repeatedly. The first time it'll hopefully pierce the first knot, and then the next time the next knot, and so forth, until you get the breath up into the head. Now this practice appears to have pretty much died out within the Indian tradition. Okay, I've spent a lot of time doing field work with Indian yogis, never met anyone who even knew the name really. I mean, some of them maybe who read texts, had seen the name in some text, but no one was practicing it. The closest I've come to it, or this, my colleague Mark Singleton made me aware of this. Now, is this going to work? This film of Krishnamacharya again doing it. Hopefully that's going to work, yeah. Doing something similar, but not exactly the same, and not in the same posture either. So you can see that he lifts himself up and then sort of twists around and drops himself down. And I have no context for this film at all. Mark provided me with it. I'm not sure where he got it from, some archive. He has no idea why Krishnamacharya was doing, if he had some explanation for this practice or not. But again, as I say, as far as I'm aware, other than this, I know of no evidence of modern Indian yoga traditions doing anything like this. But what we do find, now hopefully this will work. Now I will get on to the fact that this, I'll explain why we think that the text was written by Buddhists and these teachings originated within a Buddhist milieu. What we do find is that something similar does survive widely is probably not the right way, not the correct way of putting it, but amongst Tibetan practitioners of yoga, in particular this variety of physical practice called Trulkhor. So you'll see here, I filmed this quite a long time ago. It was at a show at the Wellcome Institute in London, where there was an exhibition of it was called the Dalai Lama's Secret Temple, put on by Ian Baker. And he invited this Lama yogi, as we would call him in Hindi, to come and demonstrate this particular practice. Okay. Okay, apparently it's as risky as it looks, and it can really hurt the base of the spine. But I went with Ian to Bhutan, and I met a practitioner. We travelled with a practitioner there, and he practiced Trulkhor, and I explained to him all the kind of principles that are taught within the Amṛtasiddhi, and he said, yeah, that's exactly the framework that we're doing this practice in. So there seems to be, obviously it's mutated a little bit from how we find it in the text, but it seems that its kind of most persistent incarnation nowadays is within Tibetan Tantric Buddhist traditions. Okay, now I have to go back to the other one. Here we go. Okay, there we go. So, yeah, like I said, I write this in the introduction, I think I first got hold of a manuscript of the Amṛtasiddhi in the early, mid-2000s, or maybe earlier, but I only really first started reading it in about 2005, 2006. And this is from, as you can see at the bottom there, no, sorry, that's in the way. Yeah, so I first started reading it in this manuscript, and it became apparent as I read it that, it was extremely important for understanding the early history of yoga, because the text also provides, most texts on physical yoga are in fact compilations. They're drawing bits from here and there, and there are often problems in the synthesis. They don't provide a kind of pure, coherent teaching on what to do. And this text is one of the few that does exactly that. And by understanding that, I think then the idea came to me that it was probably one of the earliest, if not the earliest, such texts. So I decided it needed editing. It wasn't until 8 or 9 years later that the Haṭhayoga project started, but I began to collect manuscripts. I got a few more. I think I read this, maybe I read this on my own, and then I got some manuscripts from Nepal, started to collate and edit the text from there. Also some South Indian manuscripts. I think we read an edition in Oxford with a collation of these 3 different groups of manuscript. But then it wasn't until, we were making reasonably good sense of it, but there were some really quite complicated passages that I couldn't make any sense of at all. And it wasn't until after a few years of pestering a colleague in the States that he eventually deigned to send me scans of this manuscript, okay, which is from, as you can see, the Beijing Library of the Cultural Palace of the Nationalities, which apparently is a rather hard to access library that Professor Leonard van der Kuyp in the 90s managed to get hold of some microfilms of certain manuscripts. And so eventually I got sent these, and reading, so collating readings of this manuscript together with those of the others, and we read that in Oxford, I think in 2015, 16, something like that, near the beginning of the Haṭhayoga project. And reading, particularly with Peter, because Peter's got expertise in Vajrayana, Tantric Buddhism, amazing expertise in Vajrayana, which I didn't have any at all. And what he was able to point out was that certain terms in the text that had been confusing to me, that I couldn't make any sense of, were in fact really key, relatively, well, to me, obscure technical terms from Tantric Buddhism. So it became clear that in order to make sense of the text, expertise in Tantric Buddhism was required. So I invited Peter to collaborate with me on editing the text, and to my delight, he agreed, and so we then set off on a process of trying to make sense of it. And that this book is the result. There was one other, and now have I got the next? Yeah. So now I'm going to point out a couple of the things in the text which really, I think, identify it as coming from a Buddhist milieu. Of course, it's somewhat controversial. You can imagine that now we're arguing that the first text to teach physical yoga was written by Buddhists, which goes against a lot of what you may have heard in the past. And of course that it was only, I didn't mention that manuscript it's got a colophon saying that it was copied in what corresponds to 1160 AD CE. And also in one of the colophons, the translator, because actually I should go back and say a bit more about this manuscript. It's very interesting in itself. You can see that the text is given in 3 registers, okay? So the top register is Sanskrit, in a kind of East Indian hand, probably. The second register is a Tibetan transliteration of the Sanskrit, so it just says the Sanskrit again, but in a Tibetan hand. And then the third one, in the cursive Tibetan script, is a translation. And the colophon of that one, if I remember rightly, is the one that names the translator. And if it's the same one, we can be reasonably certain that he was a well-known translator who was active in the late 11th century. So that gives us a date before which the text must have been composed. And we've sort of we haven't got a date earlier than that to say it must be later than something, but we're guessing it's probably mid 11th century. Okay, Buddhist features. So there's one right at the beginning, which again I didn't realize at the time because I wasn't particularly well versed in these matters. But in the opening Mangala verse of the whole text, we get a mention. I won't translate the whole thing, but we get a mention there. It says Chinna Mastar Prashastam. Okay, so Chinna Mastar literally means she whose head has been cut off. Okay, and I think I have an image there. You see, so well-known deity here, still worshipped in Bengal quite widely as one of the Dasha Mahavidyas, so the 10 sort of forms of the great goddess. Now you see that only manuscript C, the old one, gets that right, writes it in an intelligible form. All the other witnesses that have this verse write some sort of gibberish that you can't make sense of. So it's clear that they didn't really understand what was going on. So you've got this Chin Madhyastam, Chinna Bhastam, Chinna Bastam. Now what I didn't know at this point was that Chinnamastar, in fact, is not found in a non-Buddhist context until about the 15th or 16th century. So this is a pretty clear fire giveaway. So there's that. And here, this is something I referred to earlier. Now this verse says, Swadhisthānena yogena yastu chittam prasadhyati shilam charvati mohena trushitaha kham pibatyapi. So the first bit there, you see Swadhisthānena yogena. Now the point here comes back to what I was saying about how the text argues pretty strongly that you can't control the mind with the mind. You have to use these bodily elements in order to overcome the mind. So the translation we have is, he who tries to control mind by means of self-empowering yoga, deludedly chews a rock and thirsty drinks the sky. Okay, so he's engaging in a pointless activity. Now, what we've translated as by means of self-empowering yoga is this first phrase in the first pada, Swadhisthānena yogena. Now, of course, if you come from a background where you study Sanskrit Hatha Yoga texts and you see Swadhisthana, your immediate thought is, the Swadhisthana chakra, which is the second of the 7 chakras, 6 or 7, or whatever system you're looking at. And that probably accounts for why a lot of the, well, all the later manuscripts, other than C, have margena. So they're probably trying to make sense of this, okay? They're probably the same boat as me, not understanding this point and thinking that it must mean something to do with a path, because margena means by the pathway, the Swadhisthana pathway. But in fact, Swadhisthana yoga is a key term in Vajrayana Buddhism, which is sometimes translated as deity yoga. So it's this idea of visualizing yourself as the deity, and it's a central practice in many Vajrayana traditions. So here the text is saying that stuff is pointless. You know, don't bother doing that. Okay, so again, this is the only way you can really make sense of this verse is by understanding its Buddhist origins. And then a third instance of this, so here I've headlined it, Vajrayana terminology misunderstood in the subsequent transmission. And the term here is kshana. Okay, so again, there's a fairly obscure Vajrayana notion of there being 4 stages of practice, each of which is accompanied by various different things in different systems. I think it's best articulated within teachings on Vajrayana sexual ritual. Okay, and you get these different names for these particular types of moments that manifest during the practice. And here you'll see in the first one, so here we got the Amṛtasiddhi version. Shunyatanu praveshopi vichitra kshana sambhavaha anahatas tada shabdo bhaveta madhyama mukat. Okay, so here the idea is then that there are also 4 different levels of emptiness. There's shunyata, or shunya, mahashunya, paramashunya, and then I can't remember what the last one is, but then they're accompanied by the experience of these different moments. Because, yeah, a sort of side point that I won't go into in much more detail is that the Amṛtasiddhi is trying to reclaim sexual yoga. Okay, it's very much for celibate yogis. It's not. It's kind of arguing against sexual practice and saying you can do these practices on your own and you get the same result. So here it's saying that you get this. You know, you enter these various different voids. You get this this vichitra kshana. This what do we call it? The variegated moment. Vichitra is quite a hard word to translate sometimes. And also these 4 stages are accompanied by 4 different internal sounds. Okay, that's what the second line means. Now, what I wanted to show you here, though, is that there's and I'll say more about this, but when the teachings of the Amṛtasiddhi get taken on by non-Buddhist traditions, the first instance of this is in this text called the Amṛauga. And here it says, so Brahma Grantes tatabhedat anandaha shunya sambhavaha vichitra kvanako dehe nahata shruyate dhvanihi. So here it appears, because generally the author of the Amṛauga actually seems to understand quite a lot of this complicated terminology, but here it seems that he doesn't. And he understands, he changes vichitra kshana to vichitra kwana, which is here in the first pada. And then you have to understand that it doesn't quite make, it's a slightly odd phrasing, and then we understand that as meaning various different sounds. So the unstruck sound that occurs in the body has various different tones. But I think what we're seeing here, and this is a theme I'll come back to, is how the subsequent tradition doesn't always understand what's been taught in previous texts. Okay, so that was just a few examples. There's plenty more which we outline in the book of Buddhist terminology and ideas within the text. Now, yeah, as I said, we had various reading sessions, various workshops. But it wasn't until, in fact, after the last workshop that we had the realization that, in fact, there's one other sort of key to unlocking the meaning of the text, is that a lot of its ideas, a lot of its metaphors, and the idea of how the practices work are couched in the vocabulary of Tantric alchemy, or just alchemy, Rasa Shastra, Rasayana, Rasavada, as you might say in Sanskrit. And I'll give you some examples of that here. So, yeah, at the end of the chapter on Mahabandha, okay, so you remember that's the great lot where you've got the Kanta Bandha and the Yoni Bandha at the top and bottom of the central channel. It says this is Samputta Yoga. Okay, now to me this was very obscure from the start. Peter recognized it because Samputta is a term that you find in some Vajrayana texts, and I think it can refer to sexual yoga, so that obviously doesn't apply here. It also sometimes means the union of the sun and moon, but not in the way that, not in the sun and moon, not the sun and moon in the yogic body that I was talking about. But in fact, the key to understanding that is that sampurta is a term in Indian alchemy. Okay, so here's a rather amazing sort of encyclopedia of Indian alchemy by Helvig, and he gives a definition here of the sampurta being a closed system, I've translated from the German, composed of two vessels in which substances are heated. In most cases, the two components are cup-shaped vessels, the first of which is filled with a reagent. The upper vessel is placed upside down on the lower one, and the joint is sealed. So the idea seems to be that by doing these two locks, this top and bottom lock, you're kind of creating this sampurta, this alchemical crucible from the body, okay, and you're sealing the breath inside this chamber. Yeah, sorry, I put that in just to remind us that that's what's going on with the Mahabandha. We actually have an intriguing reference I found in the later old Hindi text attributed to Kabir, this Raga Gaudi, in which a similar idea is presented. It says, Ila Pingala Bharti Kinhi Brahma Agni Parjari. He's saying here, so you should make a bharti, which is a still, normally, in fact, what that means is a still for making alcohol, for distilling alcohol. So by heating it up, the pure essence comes out of the top of the still. And the Ila and Pingala are the left and right channels. This, I'm not sure, this image isn't 100% appropriate, but it's the best I could come up with. This is depicting distillation for making perfume rather than for making alcohol. And the Brahma Agni Parjari means light the fire, light the Brahma Agni. So as you recall in the yogic body of the Amṛtasiddhi, there's a fire at the base of the central channel. So this, intriguingly, this kind of metaphor does seem to persist within the more vernacular tradition. But within the Sanskrit tradition, it seems to get confused or die out. People stop understanding it. So once this alchemical notion had, this alchemical framing of the text was realized, certain other phrases that had been escaping us became clear or clearer what they meant. So you'll see here that there's this notion that tada bindus chichitam cha mriyate vayunasaha. So this is saying bindu, if you don't understand what's going on, you think it's saying bindu and mind are killed, they die together with the breath, because mriyate means to die, okay? But in fact, in alchemy, there's this notion of marana. It's one of the normally 18 sanskaras, so the 18 processes which mercury was put through in the process of perfecting it, making it into this sort of solid, perfected, giving it this solid, perfected state. And so again, quoting Helvig, marana involves heating a substance and thereby changing its state, usually through calcination or oxidation, so that it becomes inert. So the idea here is you're stilling the breath, you're stopping them from moving. Okay? And then, so then we find, so remember I said that this text, the Amṛtasiddhivel, here I'm quoting from the Amṛtasiddhivel, which is probably 12th century, not much later than the Amṛtasiddhi, takes its teachings but puts them in a Shaiva context, a non-Buddhist context. And I think that the author of the Amṛtasiddhivel, he fully understands what's going on, okay? So he completely rephrases it. This is not a verse taken from the Amṛtasiddhi. He rewrites it. And he talks about, this is talking about Kundalini. Kundalini we don't find in the Amṛtasiddhi. Kundalini is a Hindu Shaiva concept. And he's saying, Rujvi bhuta tata shaktihi kundali sahasa bhavet tadasau maranavastha jayate dvipurtasrita. Okay, so the idea is that through this process, I won't go into the details, but Kundalini becomes straight, then she, tada asau, maranavastha jayate. We have to understand that as a bahuvrihi for the Sanskritists. She becomes one whose state, whose avastha is marana, is death. Okay, and then also interestingly here, dvipurtasrita. And that means when she is inside, or in asrita, the dvipurta. Now, dvipurta is clearly a synonym of sampurta. Okay, meaning of this double chamber that we had before, this alchemical chamber. Maranavastha, she attains the state of stillness. She dies. Okay, but again, we know from this alchemical understanding it means that she stops moving. That may sound odd to people who think of Kundalini, the idea of Kundalini being that she rises up the central channel, okay? And that is a sort of very widespread later notion, but in fact in most, and I haven't done a sort of comprehensive survey of this, but in most of the early texts that deal with Kundalini, she doesn't in fact rise up the central channel. What you have to do, whatever practices are involved in the text, and she's coiled at the base of the central channel, and then she will straighten up, but she'll stop. And the fact that she's before she was blocking it, but by straightening up, she leaves enough space for the air to go up the central channel. So that's what I think is being got at here. But then, so I think that whoever the redactor of the Haṭhayoga was knew exactly what was going on. But then that same verse is borrowed is used verbatim, word for word, in the Haṭhapradipika. Okay, this probably 1400, circa 1400 compilation of yoga teachings, which are then reframed and other things added, but it became hugely influential. So that verse is in there, as are quite a few others from the Haṭhayoga. But then if we look at the commentary, I think I've got this highlighted. Yeah, he says, so this is Brahmananda in 1835. He tries to make sense of Dviputta, and he's saying Dve Putte, the two chambers, are the Ida and Pingala. Okay, so the two channels here. So he's not getting it at all. He also says, the Yukta Bhavadeva are probably contemporaneous, later, maybe a little bit earlier than the Jyotsna. Also seems to think that Dviputta means the nostrils, so kind of related concept. But none of those, when you think about it, really makes any sense. So it's pretty clear that this alchemical framing that these practices originate in is then completely forgotten, at least in the Sanskrit tradition. As I showed you in the vernacular tradition, there seems to be some remaining understanding of it. Okay, so that's what I'm going to say really specifically about the Amṛtasiddhi itself. I hope I don't run out of time. What time I meant to go on to, we go until 6:30, is that right? We started a bit late. Anyway, I will try and speed through this so we have a bit of time for questions. But what I'm now going to look at is what we can learn, well, some ideas that studying closely the Amṛtasiddhi in its context then inspired and helped to make sense of the subsequent development of Haṭhayoga, of physical yoga practice. So when I proposed the Haṭhayoga project, and it was shortlisted for one of these big European Research Council grants, and I was called to Brussels for an interview. Because it was about yoga, most people just sort of asked slightly facile, easy questions, and I felt that the whole process was a bit of a waste of time. Luckily, I got the grant. Obviously, that wasn't a waste of time. But the one difficult to answer question was, why are you concentrating on North India? Why is South India not really a feature of your proposal? And I can't even really remember what I spluttered out in response, but I don't think it was particularly coherent. But I had, like I think everyone else studying these traditions beforehand, had assumed that for some reason, I don't know why we assumed this, that the sort of Siddha tradition and the Haṭhayoga tradition was more to do with probably partly to do with this romantic notion of the yogis living in the Himalayas and all of that, in the Himalaya. But actually, in the process of working in the project, it has become completely apparent that actually all these early texts were written in the Deccan or further south, and I'll just say a bit about that. So first of all, Amṛtasiddhi, I mean, the evidence for this is reasonably sketchy, in fact, but perhaps from Maharashtra. We've only got one firm piece of evidence for that. Which way round did I do this? And then I think that the next text, the Haṭhayoga, so the one I've mentioned a couple of times, that draws on the Amṛtasiddhi and is the first non-Buddhist text to teach any of this stuff, that I think we could be reasonably confident was composed in Mangalore on the southwest coast. Okay, now the evidence for that is here from this circa 1400 Telugu text, so vernacular text called the Navanatha Charitramu, which says that it talks of the I think I've just written that wrong because I put that in this morning. It should be Amṛta Gya Siddhi. was by Virupaksha, which this text is, the teachings are attributed to him. And this, the Navanatha Charitramu says he's from Maharashtra. It also, as the title demonstrates, it's about the deeds of the 9 Naths, so these famous 9 yogis, and one of whom is called Manjunatha, okay, which is quite unusual. We don't know of any other text, because there's lots of treatments of 9 Naths, but I don't think any others. Maybe there's actually one from Kadli mentions Manjunatha. But it talks about this Manjunatha, who's the son of Matsyendra, resides in Mangalore, where the king's chief minister is called Buddha Siddha or Siddha Buddha. This varies in between manuscripts. Now, I think interesting here is that the opening verse of the Amarauga is in praise of this Siddha Buddha, okay? Again, you find it switching around in the manuscripts of that text to Buddha Siddha. So that, I think, is of importance, but also, to this day, in Mangalore, there's this temple, the Kadri Manjunatha temple, okay? And it's now it's a regular Hindu temple. The main icon of Manjunatha is well, I say icon, it's aniconic. It's a stone said to be a sort of a natural-born image of Shiva. It doesn't look much like a linga. But then, you can't really see here, but down the sides, in these, in the kind of corridors to the side of the central shrine, are these amazing Buddhist murtis, Buddhist images, Chola-style bronzes from the 11th century. Okay, so this is on the left of the central shrine, and it's actually of Manju Vajra. So I think what's happened here is that originally, possibly that one or another image I'll show in a second, probably this one, was the central image of the shrine, and then once the place was taken over by non-Buddhists, was moved to the side. Still there, they haven't got rid of it, but it's not, you kind of have to peer in through these little slats to see the murti. And he's worshipped as Brahma now, of course, not as Manju Vajra. Then on the other side, here, on the left, so in the left picture here, we have this image of Lokeshwara, also Avalokiteshwara, okay, and that, so yeah, we know the date of these images from an inscription. They're dated to 1068. But what seems to have happened here is that just up the hill from the main temple is a monastery, a vihara. Well, it was called a vihara, now it's a mata, vihara being a Buddhist word, because we know from the inscription that there was that it was called a vihara earlier on. But there is a monastery of the Nath yogis, okay, of the Nath yogi sampradaya, which the Amarauga text is associated with. It's, as you saw, its teachings are attributed to one of the 9 Nathas. Now, that on the right-hand side there is the image that's currently there of Matsyendra as the main, the chief Nath, the kind of first human Nath of that tradition. Now, you can kind of tell there that the iconography is pretty similar to Lokeshwara. What seems to have happened is that they completely adopted the iconography of Lokeshwara. There's an earlier image of Matsyendra from Kadri in the museum there, which again is very similar. But the real kind of, what do they say, the smoking gun, the dead giveaway, I think, is you can't really see here, but on the top of the crown of Jata on the right of Matsyendra, and I've got a detail here, you have this, this anthropomorphic image. So on the left, Lokeshwara, as a bodhisattva, is always depicted with one of these cosmic Buddhas. Okay? He's always with Amitabha, because he's in the lineage of Amitabha. Now on the right, on Matsyendra, you have this small anthropomorphic image, which is, you don't find this on any other non-Buddhist image in India, as far as I'm told. I've mentioned this to lots of art historians. No one has contradicted me here. So it seems that this is really directly borrowing this concept. I think that this is the real giveaway. Who it is, we can't really be sure. Presumably Shiva as Adinatha, but there's no contextual data to tell us what's going on there. So I argue in that 2019 article that this is the location, this is where the Amarauga was composed, and that the Tantric Buddhist teachings of the Amṛtasiddhi were taken on into this Tantric Shaiva or Siddha Shaiva text. And the Kadri Mata is still a flourishing Nath monastery to this day, in fact, interestingly enough. So this chap here on the left, he's, what's his name? Is he Mahesh Nath? I can't remember his name exactly. I think it's Mahesh Nath. But this is a big ceremony in 2016 that I was lucky enough to attend, where he's being initiated. It happens every 12 years. And it's his Abhisheka, he's being made the Raja Yogi, so the king yogi of this area. And I could speak at length about that, but I won't, because we have a long history going back at least to the 13th, 14th century of this idea of the Raja Yogi in this region. Okay, so that's the Amṛtasiddhi in Haṭhayoga. I will speed up a bit here because we're running out of time, but I think I would now argue that I'm going to show you the names here of subsequent important texts in the history of Haṭhayoga. So the Viveka which I've been editing for a long time, nearly ready with. I'll say that probably won't come out for a year or so. Goraksha Shataka. For various reasons, I think we can argue that these are from this region. Then there's another text, the Dattatreya Yoga Shastra, which I will be sending off for publishing next week, I think. I've just finished the index, finally, and I argue in there that it's probably from the Sringeri tradition down there in that area of Karnataka. Similarly, the Vasishta Samhita, one of the first texts, or not one of the first, but in the earliest lineage to teach non-seated asana practice, so balancing postures and so forth. That's from quite far south. Shiva Samhita, probably also from Sringeri. So all these texts, once this idea sparked that, hang on, I think, these texts are probably, the first ones are based in South India or the Deccan, it became, that kind of was a clue to locating the others. Oh, and the Yoga Bija, also part of that sort of Marathi tradition. And then finally, the Haṭhayoga, and I'm going to show you a rather bamboozling diagram in a second, but the Haṭhayoga, which draws on all of these, apart from the Amṛtasiddhi, I don't think it draws directly on the Amṛtasiddhi. That, I think, was almost certainly composed in Sri Shailam in Andhra Pradesh. And there's the bamboozling diagram. So you see the Amṛtasiddhi at the top, on the top left, and these are all the various different texts which contribute to the Haṭhayoga and showing all their relationships. Now, of the ones that we can locate, they are all in, they locate their place of composition. They're all in South India. I put a question mark on the Khechri Vidya because, so I'm just coming to the end of a project to edit the Haṭhayoga, which has been a whole different ballgame because we obtained over 200 manuscripts of it. We whittled them down, we've identified different groups, got them down to about 20, and we've identified the earliest recension, the earliest form of the text. And rather confusingly, the Khechri Vidya, which I edited for my PhD, is not. The quotations which I had thought were in the Haṭhayoga from the Khechri Vidya are not in that earliest recension, so actually I don't really know the date of it anymore. But yeah, you see, this is kind of, one point of this diagram is to illustrate the intertextuality, what's going on here. They're all borrowing so much from each other, these texts. So the question then comes, why was this corpus composed? What's going on here? Why are there so many texts? And I used to, before the project started, I had various kind of slightly sketchy ideas about, that firstly, that these practices were all very old, and that they only get written down for the first time about 1,000 years ago. I now don't think that's true, but hang on, I'll jump ahead of myself if I say that now. Why was the corpus composed? Previous hypothesis, ascetic practitioners of yoga codified ancient practices for the first time in order to popularize them. I had this idea, this is, if you know about theories about Indian literature during this period, that would be the beginning of the process of vernacularization and, vernacular languages becoming important and sharing teachings, making them more popular and so forth. But it really wasn't very thought out, and with hindsight, as I said, it sounds like nonsense. Now, the problems with that are, why use Sanskrit? If your motive is to popularize practices, you don't write texts in Sanskrit, because hardly anyone can read Sanskrit. Especially these cryptic texts on yoga techniques. Why so many similar texts? Why are there lots of different texts saying pretty much the same thing or borrowing from each other? Why are they all appearing at the same time? Why are women explicitly excluded? So these texts quite, and the Amṛtasiddhi itself says you shouldn't associate with women, at least in the early part of the practice, when we know from various vernacular sources and also from temple stature and so forth that women were practicing yoga at this time. And finally, you know, why do some of these texts display ignorance of what the practices really were, you know, how they were to be performed? For example, there's one in the another text that I'm about to publish, I shouldn't say that, hopefully within the next year or so, the Goraksha Shataka, which teaches one of its key practices for stimulating kundalini is yanking on the tongue. You wrap a cloth around the tongue and pull on it, and that's meant to pull the central channel up and stimulate kundalini. And later texts just don't understand that at all, and they try and make sense of wrapping the tongue around the stomach, because it's not explicitly said that the cloth goes around the tongue. But it's with contextual material, one can be very certain that that is the case. So there's, you know, what's going on there, and that, I mean, I think that the reason for that is just literally sort of copy and paste, and people misunderstanding what they're copying and pasting. But oh gosh, it's already 25 past. I will try and hurry through this. But so now what I believe is that all these texts are the products of various different monastic institutions from different religious traditions. Okay, so basically it's a bit like, you know, yoga schools today, all these different yoga schools perhaps trying to get out their YouTube videos or something like that. Here we've got different monastic institutions from different lineages all producing Sanskrit texts on physical yoga practice. And that, so the new hypothesis, the text of the Hatha corpus, so yeah, that one, the previous slide was just identifying some of the monasteries that the texts were associated with. The new hypothesis is that the texts of the Hatha corpus were composed by monastic institutions from a wide range of religious traditions, including Buddhism, Shaivism, Vaishnavism, and Jainism, hence they're being in Sanskrit. Okay, so these institutions, they functioned also a bit like universities, all right? You'd have elite male, normally ascetics, could travel between them, study at one or other, because these texts, even though there are certain markers in them of what religious lineages they come from, they're really not banging the drum for saying, you know, you have to join our sect in order to do these practices. So I think that indicates that, well, that indicates that people from different traditions were studying at different places. It also enabled the teachings, the verses, to be borrowed by different texts and shared between the different schools. Their occasional ignorance of practical details, which I mentioned, and their antipathy towards women. So they're being produced in all male, you know, elite male scholarly environments where women were not welcome, not part of the scene. Why did they do this? Well, I think I've just covered some of that, but I would also argue now that physical yoga was a new phenomenon in India about 1,000 years ago. So that's a big claim. Maybe I can, if people want to hear more about that, they can ask me questions about that, because I could speak at length about that. And you'll see there, put in brackets with precursors in China. That's, again, slightly inflammatory statement probably. And we do have I think we have one footnote hinting at that in the book. But I will try and summarize this quickly. So in India, external alchemy, where you're playing around with mercury and so forth and trying to transmogrify it, whatever the word might be, that appears in the 6th or 7th century CE, but in China we get texts on that from about the 3rd century. And then in China from about the 7th century we get texts on internal alchemy, okay, which have very similar principles to a lot of what we find in the Amṛtasiddhi. So this idea of the sun and the moon and them moving around and the knots blocking the central channel and so forth, we find a lot of that in these Chinese texts. What we don't find, though, is the practices. Okay, we don't find similar practices in the Chinese text. So I'm not saying the whole thing was imported directly from China, but there's definitely some connection going on. And we don't have, I could talk at length, but I can see that time is running out, so I'll just say we really don't have any evidence of any of these new physical methods being practiced in India prior to about 1,000 years ago. What else did I say? Monasteries were newly ascendant in South India and the Deccan, so this is the period when monasteries start to become powerful in their own right. They become, the heads of the monasteries start to function like kings. In fact, they become extremely powerful. You know, they're commissioning texts, they're building temples, they're governing areas as well. And they're seeking to formalize and domesticate asceticism. Each tradition is, as I said, you know, like modern schools of yoga trying to stake their claim to how yoga is practiced. They're each trying to do that. And then finally, a lot of the subsequent texts, not the Amṛtasiddhi itself, but from the Haṭhayoga onwards, there's this idea of Raja Yoga, okay? And I think it's not an accident that we also have evidence from this period of the heads of these monasteries being called Raja Yogis and functioning like kings, because in some of the texts we get these teachings on these practices, including methods of kind of sexual continence, which are said to enable the yogi to live, to succeed in yoga, and at the same time break the usual rules, okay, i.e. not be celibate and not have to, you know, live in a hut on their own, eating a restricted diet and so forth. So I think this aspect of it is trying to justify the lives of these heads of the monasteries, which we know from inscriptional evidence and some other travelers' reports from the early period that the heads of the monasteries sometimes were married, they certainly lived in great luxury and so forth. So they were not living the same kind of ascetic yogi lifestyle of the sort of rank and file, the regular members of the monasteries. So I think that's my last slide. I'm sorry I had to hurry through that a bit at the end. Hopefully there's time, well, I bang on 6:30, but hopefully there's time for a few questions.